The notification arrived on a Thursday morning while Caroline was making school lunches. She was standing at the kitchen counter, spreading peanut butter on the kind of brown bread her daughter Isla insisted upon, and her son Finn had recently decided he hated, when her phone buzzed against the granite with the particular urgency of something that needed attention. She glanced at it with the automatic, half-present attention of a mother in the middle of a morning routine, and nearly looked away. The notification was from her banking app, a joint account she and David had shared for 16 years, for household expenses. The balance had dropped by £14,000 overnight. She stood very still. The knife was still in her hand. From upstairs, she could hear Finn arguing with his school shoes, and Isla practicing the 7 times table in the sing-song way her teacher had taught them, and the ordinary morning sounds of a house that was, in approximately 45 minutes, going to empty out and leave her alone with what she had just read. £14,000.
Gone.
Overnight. From the account she paid the mortgage from. She put the knife down. She picked up the phone. She opened the banking app and looked at the transaction. The pay field said, D. Hartley, personal transfer. David had transferred £14,000 to himself. She stood at the kitchen counter for the remaining 45 minutes of the school run preparation in a state of extraordinary calm, which was either shock or something she had been building toward for longer than she knew. She made Finn's lunch with the brown bread he said he hated and Isla's with the bread she insisted upon. She found Finn's missing shoe behind the radiator in the hallway. She kissed them both goodbye at the door and watched the car disappear around the corner with David driving and both children in the back, and then she went inside and sat at the kitchen table and opened her laptop. What she found in the next 2 hours would not surprise her as much as she expected, and that absence of surprise, the way the pieces fit together with the quiet inevitability of something she had been sensing for months without knowing how to name, was, she later said, the most clarifying and the most devastating thing about all of it. She had known something was wrong. She had not known how wrong. Now she was going to find out. Caroline and David Hartley had been married for 16 years when the £14,000 notification arrived. They had met in their mid-20s through mutual friends, a dinner party in Bristol that had overrun into an impromptu pub visit, the kind of evening that deposits itself in the memory as the start of something significant. He had been funny in a way that felt effortless, which she had later learned was not effortless at all but carefully practiced. She had been the kind of woman who asked questions that other people found unexpectedly perceptive, which he had told her on their third date was the thing that had made him certain she was interesting. They had built what looked, from most angles, like a genuinely good life. Caroline was a secondary school English teacher, Year 10 and 12 literature and language, the age group that most teachers found exhausting and that she found, paradoxically, the most rewarding. There was something about adolescents on the cusp of forming their actual opinions about the world, encountering the books that would stay with them, that she had never been able to locate in younger children or adults. She was good at it in the way that matters. Not performative, not popular in the easy sense, but trusted. Her students came back to her years later. David worked in commercial property. He assessed and brokered deals on commercial buildings, warehouses, office developments, retail units, in the Midlands and Southwest. It was well-paid work that he was good at and that he found, Caroline suspected, somewhat less interesting than he let on. He had always given the impression of a man who had chosen stability over ambition and occasionally looked up from it with something wistful in his expression, though he had never said so directly, and she had learned over 16 years not to push on things he was not ready to discuss. They had Isla, 11, and Finn, 9. They had a 4-bedroom house in a village outside Bristol that they had spent 7 years making into something they were proud of. They had a shared social life, 3 couples they saw regularly, a habit of Sunday walks and reasonably good wine on Friday evenings, the accumulated rituals of a partnership that had settled into itself. The year before the notification had been different. Caroline had noticed it without fully naming it. David had become quieter, not dramatically, not in ways she could easily point to, but in the specific way of a person carrying something they are not ready to put down. He had started going to the gym at unusual hours. He had taken 3 work trips in a 4-month period to a Birmingham client that he had previously visited once or twice a year. He had been on his phone more. When she had asked twice whether everything was all right, he had said yes, of course. Work was busy, he was tired, she worried too much. She had believed him because she had wanted to, and because she was busy, and because the marriage had been good enough for long enough that she had not developed the particular suspicious vigilance that protects people who need protecting. She had simply noticed, filed it, gone on, until the notification. She opened the banking app first and looked at the full transaction history for the joint account. Going back 3 months, she could see a pattern she had not previously noticed. Small transfers out, ranging from £200 to £800, occurring every 10 days to a fortnight to the same payee. D. Hartley, personal transfer. Not the same personal account she knew about, the one he used for his own spending money, the card she occasionally used herself for small purchases when she'd forgotten her own. Different last 4 digits. She opened the folder on her laptop where she kept scanned household documents, insurance policies, service records, the mortgage paperwork. She searched for any account statement with those last 4 digits. There was nothing. She made herself a cup of tea. She sat back down. She thought about what she knew about David's finances, which she was beginning to understand was considerably less than she had assumed. Their financial arrangement had always been practical rather than deeply examined. Both salaries went into their respective personal accounts. A fixed sum from each went into the joint account for household expenses. David handled the mortgage, having set it up in his name initially before the marriage, and then refinanced it as a joint mortgage 3 years in. He paid it from the joint account. She saw the outgoing each month. She had never, in 16 years, had any reason to doubt what was being paid or to whom. She thought about this for a moment. Then she opened the mortgage lender's website. It took her 20 minutes and 2 phone calls to establish that the mortgage on their house was being paid. That was not the problem. That was one of the only things that was not the problem. She called her friend Diane, who worked in financial compliance. She told her what she had found without dramatizing it. Diane said after a brief pause, "Do you want to know how to find out if he has accounts you don't know about?" Caroline said, "Yes." Diane told her. It was not complicated. It required a letter to a credit reference agency, a small administrative fee, and several working days. Caroline sent the letter that afternoon from the post office on her way back from school. Then she went home and made dinner and sat across from David and helped Isla with her French homework and read Finn's chapter and did not say a word. The report arrived 11 days later, on a Saturday morning when the children were at their respective weekend activities and David was in the garden. Caroline sat at the kitchen table and opened it. There were 2 accounts she had never seen. A current account opened 14 months ago with a challenger bank she did not recognize, and a savings account with a building society opened 8 months ago. She looked at the credit limits and the payment histories. Both accounts were paid promptly. Both showed regular activity. The current account had a credit limit of £5,000 and a recent balance she could not see. Credit reports show the structure, not the real-time balance. She thought about the £14,000. She thought about the smaller transfers over the preceding months. She thought about the Birmingham client and the unusual gym hours and the way he had been on his phone in rooms she wasn't in. She called Diane again. Diane said, "You're going to need a solicitor. Not for advice, for information. A family law solicitor can tell you what you're entitled to request formally, and under what circumstances you can request it, and what happens if he refuses to disclose." Caroline said, "I think I need to know how much is in those accounts first." Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do you want to know what I think is happening?" Caroline said, "Tell me." Diane said, "I think he's been preparing." Caroline looked out the kitchen window at David, who was weeding the vegetable bed he had started last spring, and which had been one of the things she had most loved about their life that year. The optimism of it, the domestic hopefulness of a man planting things he intended to harvest. She said, "I think so too." She had not intended to listen. She wanted that to be clear. She had come downstairs at 11:45 on a Tuesday night because she couldn't sleep. This was not unusual in the weeks since the credit report. Sleep had become a luxury that her mind was unwilling to allow, and she had intended to make chamomile tea and read until she felt drowsy. She heard David's voice from the study, which was unusual. The study door was not fully closed. She stopped on the landing. He was speaking quietly, in the careful, lowered register of a person who believes themselves to be alone in a sleeping house. She could not hear every word. What she could hear, assembled into meaning over approximately 3 minutes, was the following. He was telling someone, a woman. She could tell from the way he adjusted his register, the particular softening of it, that it was nearly sorted, that the timing needed to be right, that he was being careful, that there had been a complication. He used that word, a complication, which she later understood was the £14,000 transfer that had shown up on her app and that he had not intended her to see. He had been expecting to move it from the joint account before the end of the month and had miscalculated the timing. He said he needed another few months. He said he was sorry. He said it wouldn't be much longer. Caroline stood on the landing for approximately 90 seconds. Then she went back to bed. She lay on her side, facing the window, and listened to the sound of the house settling around her, and she thought about the word sorted. She thought about what needed to be sorted. And she thought about the fact that she had been, in the language he had just used on the phone, a complication. She was a complication in the financial arrangements for the end of her own marriage. She turned this over. She examined it from several angles. And then she did something that she had not expected of herself in that moment. She felt something solidify. She had been, she understood, standing on uncertain ground for months, sensing something without being able to see it, afraid of what seeing it might cost her. Now she could see it. It was exactly as bad as she had feared. And somehow, paradoxically, exactly as bad as she had feared was easier to stand on than the fog of suspecting. She knew what she was dealing with. She knew what she needed to do. She reached for her phone and opened the Notes app. She typed, very quietly, in the dark, what he was saying, what time it was, what she had understood from it. She described his voice. She described the register. She noted the word complication. Then she plugged her phone into charge, and she lay in the dark, and she made a plan. She contacted a family law solicitor the following week. She chose one whose firm was in Bath rather than Bristol, partly for the practical reason that she was less likely to encounter anyone she knew, and partly because she had read the firm's reviews carefully and been struck by one line in a client testimonial. She made me feel like I was the one with power, not him. The solicitor's name was Priya Mehta. She was in her early 40s, direct in a way that Caroline found immediately reassuring, and she had the particular quality of someone who has heard a version of this story many times and remains genuinely interested in the specific version in front of her. Priya listened to everything. She looked at the credit report. She looked at the screenshot of the banking notification. She looked at the notes Caroline had made on her phone that Tuesday night. Then she said, "The good news is that what he has done makes the legal position clearer, not murkier. The money in those accounts, all of it, regardless of when it was transferred, regardless of whose name it's in, is a matrimonial asset if it was accumulated during the marriage or transferred from shared funds during the marriage. And we can compel full disclosure." Caroline said, "What does that mean in practice?" Priya said, "It means that once divorce proceedings are initiated, he is legally required to provide a complete and accurate statement of all assets, every account, every investment, every policy. If he fails to disclose or discloses inaccurately, the consequences for him are significant. Judges take a dim view of it. Courts can draw adverse inferences, meaning they can assume the undisclosed amount is more than it was, not less, and divide accordingly." Caroline said, "He's been moving money for at least 14 months. Priya said, "Then the forensic accountant will find it. That's what they do." Caroline sat with this for a moment. Then she said, "I need to know the number. Before I do anything, I need to know how much we're actually talking about." Priya said, "That's a reasonable position. Let's talk about how to get it." The forensic accountant Priya engaged was a man named Gerald Cho, who worked for a firm that specialized in exactly this kind of case, the careful disassembly of a financial history that someone had constructed to obscure itself. He was methodical, unhurried, and had the air of a man who found hidden money the way other people found crossword solutions, with a mixture of professional satisfaction and mild contempt for the person who thought the hiding would hold. What he established, over 6 weeks of work, was the following. Over 14 months, David had transferred a total of £63,450 from the joint account and from his own personal account into the two undisclosed accounts. He had done it in irregular amounts and irregular intervals, a deliberate strategy to avoid triggering bank monitoring systems and to avoid creating an obvious pattern that a spouse scrolling through an app might notice. In addition, he had overstated 3 business expense claims to his employer over the same period, not by a dramatic amount, nothing that had triggered an audit, but cumulatively adding approximately £12,000 in reimbursements that had gone into the undisclosed current account rather than being offset against genuine expenses. The total in the two accounts, at the time of Gerald's assessment, was £71,230. The remainder of what had been transferred had been spent on what? Gerald could not determine specifically from the bank records, but the pattern of expenditure in the undisclosed current account over the 14 months included restaurant charges, hotel bookings, and retail purchases that were inconsistent with David's stated working schedule and location for those dates. Caroline read Gerald's report at Priya's office on a Tuesday afternoon, in the particular focused silence of someone absorbing information they had prepared themselves for but which still, when laid out in black and white with pound signs and dates, cost something to read. She asked only one question when she finished. She said, "How long was she involved?" Gerald said carefully, "I can establish financial patterns with dates attached. The hotel bookings begin 14 months ago, which aligns with the first account opening. But the question of what predates the financial record is outside what I can determine." Caroline said, 14 months. He opened the account 14 months ago. Gerald said, "Yes." Caroline nodded. She thanked him for the report. She put it in her bag. She drove home and collected the children from school and made pasta for dinner and helped Finn with his times tables, the sevens, which he had been struggling with for 3 weeks, and did not speak to David until after the children were in bed, when she came downstairs and said, "I need to talk to you." She had thought carefully about the confrontation. She had thought about it for 3 weeks, through the process of the forensic account, through 2 more conversations with Priya, through a long and honest conversation with her sister Rachel, who lived in Edinburgh, and who was, of all the people Caroline might have turned to, the one most capable of clear thinking under emotional pressure. She had decided she was not going to perform this. She was not going to allow it to become an argument, or a scene, or something that exhausted her before it had produced any useful outcome. She was going to be specific. She was going to be calm. And she was going to let him understand from the beginning that she already knew what there was to know. She was not asking questions. She was delivering information. She sat across from him at the kitchen table. She had the folder from Gerald Cho in front of her. She did not open it immediately. She said, "I know about the accounts. I know about the transfers. I know how much is in them. I know about the hotel bookings." David looked at the folder. He looked at her face. He did not speak. She said, "I want you to understand that I am not here to have an argument with you about any of this. I am here because you're going to need to make some decisions in the next few days, and I thought you should have the information you need to make them." She opened the folder. She put Gerald's summary page in front of him. She watched him read it. She watched his face do several things in sequence, a kind of rapid internal processing that moved through surprise and something like assessment, and then settled into a stillness that she recognized after 16 years as the thing David did when he had decided he had no usable position. He said, "I was going to tell you." She said, "When?" He didn't answer. She said, "I know the answer to that, actually. You were going to tell me when you were ready to leave. When you had enough money separately to do it on your own terms. That was what needed to be sorted." He looked at the table. She said, "That word. Sorted. I heard you on the phone. I heard what you said." A longer silence. She let it sit. She had learned, over the preceding weeks, that the impulse to fill silence was something she needed to resist. The silence was doing work. She let it. He said eventually, "I'm sorry, Caroline. I know that's not enough." She said, "I know it isn't. I'm not telling you that to hurt you. I'm telling you because I want you to understand that I know exactly what has happened and that we are going to resolve it legally and accurately, and that the starting point for that resolution is a complete disclosure of every account you hold. Your solicitor will tell you the same thing." She closed the folder. She stood up. She said, "I'll be in the spare room tonight. We can talk to the children on Saturday." She went upstairs. She sat on the edge of the bed in the spare room and looked at the wall for about 20 minutes. Then she got up, showered, and went to sleep. She has described this as one of the clearest nights of sleep she had had in months. This is the part that is hardest to write and the part that Caroline has been most willing to discuss. Because everything else, the accounts, the transfers, the hotel bookings, the forensic accountant, the legal process, all of that is navigable. The children are not navigable. They are the part that has no good answer, only less bad ones. She and David told Isla and Finn on a Saturday morning, as she had said. They sat in the living room. Caroline had thought very carefully about the words. She had spoken to a child therapist the previous week, a single session, focused specifically on age-appropriate language for an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old, and she had used what she learned. She said, "Mom and Dad love you both more than anything. That is not going to change. But Mom and Dad have decided that they need to live separately, and so our family is going to look a bit different soon." Isla cried immediately. Finn asked if they were getting divorced like Toby Marchetti's parents. Caroline said yes, it was like that. Finn nodded and seemed, in the specific way of 9-year-old boys, to be running a parallel process that would surface later, at unexpected moments, as questions about logistics and sleeping arrangements rather than feelings. Isla asked, "Did someone do something wrong?" Caroline and David looked at each other, across the living room, across the children who were between them on the sofa. Caroline said, "Grown-up relationships are complicated, and sometimes even people who love each other can't make a life together anymore. That's nobody's fault in a way that makes sense for children to understand." David said nothing. He was looking at Isla. His expression was something Caroline did not want to catalog. She has been asked whether she resented, in that moment, the fact that she was protecting him with her careful words. She has always given the same answer. She was not protecting him. She was protecting Isla and Finn. The difference mattered enormously to her. The proceedings took 17 months. They were not amicable, that is not quite the right word, but they were managed. David secured his own solicitor, who was experienced and professional and who clearly communicated to David at an early stage that the forensic trail was comprehensive and that contesting the disclosure findings was not an advisable strategy. David did not contest them. Full disclosure revealed a total marital estate that, once the undisclosed accounts were included, was significantly larger than Caroline had understood. The family home had appreciated considerably in the 7 years since they had bought it. David's pension was substantial. There were additional investment accounts that the forensic accountant had flagged for examination. The settlement reflected the full picture. Caroline's solicitor argued successfully for an adjustment that accounted for the deliberate financial dissipation, the systematic removal of funds from the marital estate with the intention of reducing Caroline's share. The court agreed. The adjustment was notable. Caroline and the children remained in the family home. David found a flat in Bristol. The arrangements for the children were established through a consent order that both parties contributed to and that, in practice, has worked adequately, not without friction, not without the specific ongoing difficulty of co-parenting with someone who has broken your trust, but adequately. She returned to teaching this September after the proceedings concluded. She had taken 6 months of compassionate leave. The school had been generous, the head teacher had been quietly extraordinary, and coming back had felt, she said, like returning to the thing that was most entirely hers. The classroom, the students, the books, the work that existed completely independently of David, that had always been hers, that he had not been able to touch. She told this story, over the course of several months, in a private online community for women navigating financial abuse in relationships. It became, within that community, a reference point. Not because it was the most dramatic story. There were worse ones, stories with more money and more deliberate cruelty, but because of how she told it. The precision of it. The way she described not as a victim reconstructing damage, but as a woman who had found the information she needed and acted on it with clarity. The post that most people in that community remember was one she wrote 11 months after the settlement. She had been responding to a woman who had just discovered something similar and was asking whether there was any point in fighting, whether it was worth the cost, whether she should just let him have what he'd taken and move on with her own life. Caroline's response was long and has been shared widely since. The relevant part said, "I want to talk about the word worth. Is it worth it? Because I think when we ask that question, we are usually asking something else, which is, do I have the energy to be someone who fights back?" And the answer to that question might be no, on any given day, for any number of entirely valid reasons. But if you are asking whether it is worth it in the sense of whether it matters, whether the money matters, whether establishing the truth of what happened matters, I want to say this as clearly as I can. Yes, it matters. Not because of the amount, though the amount matters practically, but because the act of hiding money from a spouse is not a financial act. It is an act that says, I do not see you as an equal in this marriage. I see you as someone whose share I can manage without your knowledge. I see you as a person whose future I can predetermine without consulting her. And the act of finding it, naming it, submitting it to the scrutiny of a court, that is not revenge, and it is not bitterness. It is the simple, factual assertion that you existed in that marriage, that your share is real, that you will not participate in the version of events where you get less because he moved the numbers before you knew you needed to count them. I am not a brave person. I did not feel brave at any point in this process. I felt tired and frightened and sometimes profoundly sad. But I understood one thing from the night I found the notification to the day the settlement was signed. The only position I could afford to take was the informed one. The only version of the story I could afford to tell was the accurate one. Everything else, all the ways I could have shrunk from it, absorbed it, pretended not to see it, would have left me with less of my own life than I was entitled to. You are entitled to your own life. The full version of it. Don't let him take the parts you haven't counted yet. Isla is 14 now. She has her mother's directness and her father's charm, which is a combination that causes Caroline a certain amount of affectionate concern. She is doing well in school. She has a best friend called Priya, not the solicitor, a different one, and she plays the violin with the focused, slightly resentful dedication of someone who knows they are good at something they haven't yet decided to love. He asked Caroline, 2 years after the divorce, a question that Caroline had been waiting for. She said, "Dad did something wrong, didn't he? That's why you didn't say it was nobody's fault in a way children could understand. You said it that way because there was a fault, but you didn't want us to know whose." Caroline looked at her daughter for a long moment. Then she said, "You're perceptive. You always have been." Isla said, "You don't have to tell me everything. I just wanted to know that I wasn't wrong." Caroline said, "You weren't wrong." Isla nodded. She seemed, in the specific way of 14-year-olds who have processed a thing and filed it accurately, satisfied. Finn had his own reckoning later. He was 12 when he asked his father directly whether Dad had another girlfriend when he and Mum were still married. David told him the truth, which was to his credit. Finn was quiet for a long time. He has not talked about it publicly. He talks to his mother about it, occasionally in the car. Finn is a car conversation person, which Caroline has always found exactly right, the moving frame making difficult things easier to approach. She does not know how it will settle in them. She knows that she did everything she could to limit the blast radius. She knows that she told them the truth in the version appropriate to their ages, and has continued to do so as they've grown. She knows that they are loved securely and continuously, and that this, more than any settlement figure, more than any legal outcome, is what she is most certain she got right. There is a kind of theft that is designed to be invisible, not the crude kind, the grabbed wallet, the smashed window, the obvious crime that announces itself. The sophisticated kind. The kind that happens inside the walls of a shared life, in accounts with similar but not identical last digits, in transfers made at intervals calibrated to avoid notice, in hotel bookings that a spouse would never think to look for because she trusted, and trust does not look. David made a calculation. He decided that the life he was building away from Caroline was worth more than the honesty he owed her, and that if he was careful enough, she would never know the scope of what she had lost. That he failed to calculate was Caroline. Not because she was specially equipped for this. Not because she had some unusual capacity for forensic thinking or legal strategy. But because when the notification appeared on her phone screen on that Thursday morning, she made a single decision. She was going to look at what was actually there. Not look away. Not minimize it. Not assume there was an innocent explanation she simply hadn't thought of yet. Look at it directly and find out what it meant. That decision, to look rather than look away, is the whole story. Everything else followed from it. She looked. She found a forensic accountant and a solicitor and a community of women who had been through the same thing. She found, within herself, a steadiness she had not known she possessed. She found, on the other side of 17 months of legal process, a version of her own life that was fully, accurately, demonstrably hers. She found the number. She made them count it. And she went back to her classroom in September, to the students who were reading Dickens and starting to understand what it meant, and she taught them the things she had spent the previous year learning herself. That the truth, however inconvenient for the people who try to hide it, has a way of becoming findable. Always. Eventually. If you decide to look. If this story moved you, or gave you something you needed, please like this video and subscribe. Leave a comment if you want to share something. And if you know someone who needs to hear this right now, please share it with them. I'll see you in the next story.